James had always tried his best to give his young son Ethan little moments of happiness, even if their life was not easy. Money was tight, and most days were spent counting coins carefully, making sure bills were paid and food lasted through the week. But Ethan loved tacos, and every once in a while, James wanted to surprise him with a small treat from Taco Bell. It was not a grand gesture, but to a father who cared deeply for his child, those little trips meant everything. That afternoon, after running a few errands, James promised Ethan they would stop by Taco Bell before heading home. Ethan's eyes lit up instantly. He was only 8 years old, but he already understood that his father worked very hard. Every time his father made a promise like this, Ethan would hug him tightly and say, "You're the best, Dad." For James, those words were worth more than gold. When they entered the restaurant, the smell of seasoned beef, melted cheese, and warm tortillas filled the air. Ethan could barely contain his excitement, bouncing on his toes as he pointed to the menu board. "Dad, can I get 2 tacos? Please," he asked with his small voice, full of joy. James smiled, ruffled his hair, and said, "Of course, buddy. Today's your day." They reached the counter, and James placed the order, 2 tacos for Ethan, 1 burrito for himself, and a drink they would share. It wasn't a big meal, but it felt like a special treat. James pulled out his worn debit card and handed it to the cashier. She swiped it once, then frowned. She swiped again and shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir," she said politely, "it's declined." James's heart sank. He quickly searched his pockets and pulled out a few coins, but they added up to barely enough for a single taco. The people behind him in line shifted impatiently, some sighing loudly, others muttering under their breath. James felt a wave of shame wash over him. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, especially with Ethan, who was now looking up at him with worried eyes. Ethan tugged on his sleeve and whispered, "Dad, it's okay. We can just get 1 taco and share." His innocence broke James's heart. He wanted to be strong for his son, but inside he felt like he was failing. "No, no, you deserve your meal," James muttered softly, trying to smile, though his voice trembled. He turned to the cashier and asked if she could cancel the order, preparing to walk away with nothing. The restaurant felt suddenly heavier, as though everyone was watching, even though most people were trying not to stare. James thought of the many nights he had skipped his own dinner just to make sure Ethan had enough to eat. He thought of all the times he had hidden his struggles so his son wouldn't feel the burden of poverty. And now, in the middle of a simple fast food place, all those struggles seemed to be laid bare. But then, a voice spoke up from behind them. Calm, steady, and kind. "Don't worry about it. I'll cover it." James turned around, confused. A man in a plain t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap stood there. He didn't look flashy or arrogant. His tone was gentle, as if helping a stranger was the most natural thing in the world. James opened his mouth to protest, but the man stepped forward, pulling out his wallet and handing the cashier his card. "Add a couple more tacos and some drinks too," the man said, smiling warmly at Ethan. The cashier's eyes widened as she processed the card. A murmur rippled through the line. Some people began to whisper and point, recognizing the man beneath the simple cap. James blinked, his mind racing. Could it really be? Standing right there, helping him and his son without hesitation, was Keanu Reeves? James almost didn't believe his eyes. This was not a glamorous movie premiere, nor a carefully staged event. This was just an ordinary afternoon in a Taco Bell, and yet one of the most famous actors in the world was standing right in front of him, paying for his son's lunch. Embarrassment and gratitude battled inside James. He wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. He wanted to refuse, but he also knew Ethan's joy mattered more than his pride. He glanced at his son, who was now staring at Keanu with wide eyes, his mouth hanging open in awe. Keanu bent down slightly to Ethan's level and said, "Don't worry, little man. Today's on me. You enjoy your tacos." Ethan's face lit up like it was Christmas morning. "Thank you, sir," he said loudly, his voice full of pure happiness. The innocence and excitement in his tone made even the other customers smile. James finally found his voice. "Sir, I don't even know how to thank you. You didn't have to do this." Keanu gave a small shrug, his eyes kind but humble. "Sometimes, we all need a little help. It's no big deal." But to James, it was a very big deal. He knew his son would never forget this moment. And deep inside, he knew he would never forget it either, the day when, in the middle of his lowest point, a stranger, who just happened to be one of the most beloved stars in the world, stepped in to lift him up with a simple act of kindness. As the food was placed on a tray, Ethan clapped his hands and hugged his father. "Best day ever, Dad," he said. James blinked back tears, whispering, "Yes, buddy. Best day ever." The tray of food was finally placed on the counter, and Ethan could hardly wait to grab it. His little hands reached for the cup of soda, and his eyes sparkled at the sight of the tacos. James, however, was still standing in a mix of shock and gratitude, not quite believing what had just happened. The man in the plain cap had stepped in so casually, as if paying for a stranger's meal was something he did every day. James carried the tray toward an empty table near the window. Ethan bounced along beside him, already talking about how good the tacos were going to taste. They sat down, but before James could take a sip of the drink, the man who had helped them walked over with his own tray. He gave a small, easy smile and asked, "Mind if I join you?" James hesitated for a second, still unsure how to act around someone like him. But Ethan quickly said, "Yes, sit with us." His innocence broke the silence, and the man slid into the seat across from them. James realized then, without a doubt, that the stranger was indeed Keanu Reeves. Even sitting there in a simple t-shirt, eating fast food, his presence carried a quiet strength. For a while, they all just ate. Ethan took big bites of his taco, occasionally stealing glances at Keanu. The boy was curious but also respectful, sensing somehow that this was a special moment. James finally cleared his throat and said, I really don't know how to thank you. I didn't want to accept it at first, but you made my son's day." Keanu looked up from his burrito, his eyes calm and gentle. "Don't worry about it," he replied. "I've been in that spot before. I know what it feels like." Those words surprised James. He couldn't imagine a man like Keanu, with all his success and fame, ever struggling the way he had just struggled at the counter. But Keanu continued, "When I was younger, I didn't always have money. There were times when a kind stranger helped me out. I never forgot those moments. That's why I try to pass it on whenever I can." Ethan leaned forward, chewing slowly, his eyes wide. "You mean, someone helped you buy food too?" he asked. Keanu chuckled softly. "Yes, little man. More than once. And it meant the world to me." The words settled over the table like a blanket of warmth. James felt something shift inside him. The embarrassment he had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of connection. Here was a world-famous actor, sitting in front of him, speaking not as a star but as a human being who understood struggle. For the next few minutes, their conversation flowed naturally. Keanu asked Ethan about school, about his favorite subjects, and what he wanted to be when he grew up. Ethan answered eagerly, saying he loved drawing and maybe wanted to be an artist. Keanu listened intently, nodding, and said, "That's wonderful. The world always needs more artists." James watched his son laugh and talk freely, his heart swelling with gratitude. It wasn't just about the tacos anymore. This was about dignity, about kindness, about the reminder that humanity still existed in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. Other customers in the restaurant had started to notice. A few whispered to each other, trying not to stare too obviously. Some recognized Keanu right away, while others just saw a man being generous and kind. A couple of people discreetly pulled out their phones, snapping photos. But Keanu didn't seem to care. His focus was on the father and son in front of him, as if nothing else mattered. James lowered his voice and said, "You don't know what this means to me. Life hasn't been easy. I just want to give my boy a good childhood, even if I can't give him much." Keanu looked at him seriously and replied, "You've already given him the most important thing, love. That's worth more than anything you can buy." James felt his throat tighten. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment, while Ethan leaned against his arm with a smile. As they finished their meal, Ethan asked the question that had been on his mind the whole time. "Why are you so kind?" His tone was innocent, but his eyes were filled with genuine curiosity. Keanu paused, then said softly, "Because kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it can change everything. One small act can make someone's whole day better. Sometimes even their whole life." The boy nodded thoughtfully, as though storing the words deep in his heart. James knew this was a lesson Ethan would carry for years. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with quiet amazement. Strangers who had once sighed impatiently in line were now smiling, touched by what they had witnessed. The cashier, who had been flustered earlier, now looked at Keanu with respect and admiration. The atmosphere had shifted entirely, from tension to warmth, all because of one simple, generous act. For James, it felt like a miracle. Not because of Keanu's fame, but because someone had chosen compassion over judgment at the very moment he needed it most. Ethan licked his fingers happily after finishing the last bite of his taco, while James leaned back in his chair, still absorbing the strange turn of events. Keanu, sitting across from them, seemed perfectly comfortable, as though he were just another ordinary man sharing lunch with new friends. There was nothing boastful about him, no hint of pride in his tone or manner. He simply enjoyed the food and the company, as though kindness was a natural part of who he was. For James, it was still surreal. He glanced around the restaurant and noticed the quiet stir Keanu's presence had caused. People were whispering, some sneaking photos, but most were just watching in awe. James felt a mix of emotions: pride that his son was experiencing such a moment, gratitude for the help, and disbelief that this was really happening. Keanu turned toward Ethan, smiling warmly. "So, what's your favorite thing to do after school?" he asked. Ethan's eyes lit up. "I like drawing superheroes. Sometimes I even make up my own. They save people and help them when they're sad." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and shyly showed it. On the crumpled page was a sketch of a caped hero with big hands, reaching down to lift up tiny people. Keanu studied the drawing carefully, nodding with genuine admiration. "That's really good. You know, superheroes aren't only in comic books or movies. Sometimes they're just regular people who do something kind for someone else." Ethan grinned proudly, tucking the paper back into his pocket. "Like you," he exclaimed. James chuckled, though his eyes grew misty. The simplicity of his son's words touched him deeply. He knew Ethan would always remember this day, not just for the tacos, but for the lesson about real-life heroes. Keanu leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly, as if sharing a secret. "You know, I don't think of myself as a hero. But I do believe every one of us can make a choice each day to be kind, to help when we can, and to see others with compassion. That's what makes the world better." James felt a weight lift from his shoulders hearing those words. He had carried guilt for so long, always feeling like he wasn't giving his son enough. But here was a man who reminded him that love and kindness mattered more than expensive toys or fancy meals. For a few moments, they all sat quietly, letting the words sink in. Ethan sipped his drink thoughtfully, clearly processing what Keanu had said. Then he asked another innocent question. Do you ever get sad? Keanu nodded slowly. Yes, of course. Everyone does. But what helps me is remembering the good I can do, even in small ways. Helping someone else always makes the sadness smaller. James found himself speaking softly, almost to himself. That's what I try to teach him too. To always be kind. Keanu gave him an approving nod. And you're doing a great job. He's a good kid, and that comes from you. The father's heart swelled with quiet pride. It was rare for anyone to notice his efforts, and hearing those words from someone like Keanu meant more than he could explain. As they continued talking, a couple of customers finally approached, politely asking for a photo. Keanu agreed with a smile but gently reminded them, let's keep it low-key. We don't want to disturb everyone here. His humility impressed James even more. Even surrounded by strangers, Keanu treated everyone with respect. Soon, the staff brought over extra food-free cinnamon twists and an extra drink saying it was on the house. They had been touched by what they witnessed, and they wanted to add to the kindness. Ethan's eyes widened with excitement, and he eagerly shared the dessert with both his father and Keanu. The small group of them laughed together, as if they had known each other for years. James couldn't help but think how different the day had turned out from what he expected. He had walked into Taco Bell worried about disappointing his son, but now he was leaving with a memory that would last forever. At one point, Ethan leaned close to Keanu and whispered, "When I grow up, I want to help people too. Just like you." Keanu placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then you'll be a true hero. And you don't have to wait until you grow up. You can start right now by being kind to your friends, your family, even strangers." The boy nodded seriously, as though accepting a great responsibility. James watched the exchange with a mix of gratitude and awe. He realized that his son had just received a lesson that no school could teach and no money could buy. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with warmth. Even those who hadn't spoken to Keanu felt the impact of his presence. A woman whispered to her friend, "I've always heard he was kind, but to see it in person, it's real." Another man nodded, saying, "That's the kind of role model the world needs." James could feel the shift in the air. What had started as an ordinary lunch had become something extraordinary, not because of fame but because of simple, genuine humanity. When the meal was nearly finished, James leaned back and sighed softly. "I can't believe this happened today. I thought it was going to be one of the hardest moments of my life, standing there unable to pay. But instead, it became one of the best." Keanu looked at him kindly. "Sometimes life surprises us. The important thing is to remember that no one is truly alone. There's always someone out there willing to help." James nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan squeezed his father's hand, his smile bright and unshakable. As they cleared the table, James knew this wasn't just a story about tacos or a celebrity encounter. This was about hope, about kindness, about the way a single moment could transform everything. And for Ethan, it was about learning that heroes don't always wear capes, they sometimes wear baseball caps and buy tacos for strangers. As Ethan finished the last piece of cinnamon twist, he leaned back with a big grin on his face. His small feet dangled off the chair, swinging happily, while James sat beside him with his hands clasped, still in disbelief over how the day had unfolded. Across the table, Keanu remained calm and relaxed, quietly sipping from his drink as though he had been there all along, simply another man enjoying a simple meal. But the truth was, his presence had transformed the entire room. By now, almost everyone in the restaurant knew who he was. A few whispered his name under their breath, others shared amazed glances, and more than one customer had their phone discreetly pointed in his direction. Yet what struck James most was how Keanu seemed unfazed. He wasn't playing for the cameras or expecting applause. Instead, he continued to focus on Ethan and James as though they were the only people who mattered. One of the Taco Bell workers, a young woman with bright eyes, nervously approached the table. She carried a small tray with extra napkins and another serving of cinnamon twists. Excuse me, she said, her voice trembling slightly, we just wanted to thank you for what you did. Her eyes flickered to James and Ethan, then back to Keanu. You didn't have to, but you reminded us all of what kindness looks like. Keanu gave her a gentle smile. Thank you. But really, anyone would have done the same. The young woman shook her head quickly. No, sir, not everyone would. That's why it matters. She placed the tray on the table and walked back, her co-workers nodding in agreement from behind the counter. James watched the interaction quietly, a lump forming in his throat. He had lived long enough to know that most people in that line earlier would not have stepped forward. In fact, some had grown impatient, annoyed at the delay. But this man had chosen compassion instead. It made James feel seen, valued, even in his struggle. Ethan, still brimming with excitement, looked around and whispered, "Dad, everyone's smiling now. Even the people who were mad before." His innocent observation was true. The tension that had once filled the restaurant had dissolved, replaced with warmth. Laughter could be heard, and even strangers began chatting with one another. Keanu leaned forward and said softly, "That's the power of one small choice. When we choose kindness, it spreads." The boy nodded, taking in the lesson as if it were a secret key to the world. For James, it was a reminder that even in moments of weakness, dignity could be restored through compassion. A middle-aged man seated nearby finally stood and walked over. He carried his phone in his hand, though he held it respectfully at his side. "Mr. Reeves," he said quietly, "I just want to say, I've always admired your work. But seeing this today, it means more than any movie. Thank you." Keanu shook his hand warmly, replying, "I appreciate that. But the real thanks goes to the people who notice and carry it forward. That's how kindness grows." The man returned to his seat, visibly moved. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some people clapped softly, not in a loud way but as if honoring something genuine. James lowered his voice and whispered to Keanu, "I don't know if you realize how much you've done. Not just for me and my boy, but for everyone watching." Keanu gave a modest shrug. "If it reminds even one person to be kinder tomorrow, then it's worth it." As they talked, Ethan suddenly asked a question that made James smile nervously. "Can you come over to our house sometime? We don't have much, but Dad makes really good soup." Keanu laughed warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's very kind of you, buddy. I don't know if I can, but I'll keep that in mind." His answer was gentle but full of sincerity, making Ethan beam with pride. Meanwhile, the staff had gathered near the counter, whispering among themselves. One of them walked over with a small gift bag, something they had quickly put together with Taco Bell merchandise and a few free meal vouchers. "This is for you," the worker said to Ethan and James. "We want you to come back whenever you can, no worries." James was taken aback. He accepted the bag with shaky hands, muttering, thank you so much." Ethan peeked inside and gasped. "Dad! They gave us more food and free coupons. This is the best day ever." His joy was so pure that the room once again filled with smiles. Keanu leaned back, observing it all with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to say anything, his presence alone spoke louder than words. Soon, more customers began approaching. One woman asked if she could share the story online, promising to focus on the kindness rather than his fame. Keanu nodded, saying, "As long as the message is about helping others, that's fine." Within minutes, phones were out, photos were shared, and the story began its journey beyond the walls of the restaurant. Strangers on the internet would soon know what had happened in that little Taco Bell on an ordinary afternoon. But for James, the real magic wasn't in the attention. It was in the way his son's eyes glowed with hope. Ethan had seen kindness in action. He had felt the strength of compassion, not just in words but in real life. James leaned over to him and whispered, "Remember this, son. It's not about money or fame. It's about the heart." Ethan nodded seriously, clutching the bag of gifts and glancing at Keanu with admiration. "I'll remember, Dad. I promise." The moment stretched like something timeless, etched into their lives forever. And while the world outside might move on, everyone inside that restaurant carried a piece of that lesson with them, that a simple act of kindness could ripple outward, touching hearts far beyond what anyone could imagine. As the afternoon sun lowered outside the glass windows of the Taco Bell, James sat quietly, trying to take in everything that had happened. He could still feel the warmth of the moment, as though it had wrapped itself around him and his son like an invisible blanket. Ethan clutched the little gift bag from the staff with excitement, and every few seconds, he would peek inside it again, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Across from them, Keanu remained the same calm, modest, and gentle, as though he hadn't just changed the lives of everyone in the room. The room had softened. Conversations were quieter now, but filled with warmth. People looked at each other differently, exchanging nods and small smiles. The tension that had once been there, the impatience, the annoyance, the usual rush of a fast food restaurant, was gone. In its place was something lighter, something hopeful. James leaned forward, speaking softly. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay what you've done. Not just for buying the meal, but for reminding me that good people are still out there." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't try to hide it. Keanu shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything. The best way to repay kindness is to pass it on when you get the chance. That's all I ask." Ethan's ears perked up, and he nodded with enthusiasm. "I can do that. I'll be kind to my friends at school. I'll share my pencils, and I'll help them if they fall down." Keanu smiled widely, his eyes softening. "That's perfect. You see, even small things matter. Helping someone up, sharing what you have, that's how you change the world." James placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, his heart swelling with pride. "You hear that, buddy? Even the smallest act counts." The boy nodded, his little face serious now. He was old enough to know this was an important lesson, one he would carry for years. After a while, Keanu glanced at the clock on the wall. He knew it was time to leave, but he didn't rush. Instead, he stood slowly, picking up his tray. People around the restaurant rose too, as though instinctively wanting to honor the moment. Some clapped softly, others simply watched with admiration. Before leaving, Keanu placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "You're doing a good job," he said simply. "Don't ever forget that." James swallowed hard, his eyes wet. "Thank you. Those words mean more than you know." Then Keanu bent down to Ethan, meeting him eye to eye. "Keep drawing your superheroes, little man. The world needs more heroes like you." Ethan's smile could have lit up the entire room. He nodded eagerly. "I will. And one day, I'll help people just like you did today." With that, Keanu gave them both a final nod and walked toward the door. The restaurant seemed to follow him with their eyes, not because he was a celebrity, but because they had just witnessed something genuine, something rare. He pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the sunlight, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. For a few moments, silence lingered inside. Then, softly, conversations began again. But this time, the tone was different. People spoke with warmth, kindness, and a sense of shared connection. Strangers who had once ignored each other in line were now chatting like old friends. James sat back down, letting out a deep breath. He felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. He looked at Ethan, who was still glowing with excitement, and knew this memory would never fade. Later that evening, as they walked home, Ethan skipped happily beside his father. "Dad," he said suddenly, "do you think people will believe us when we tell them what happened?" James chuckled softly. "Maybe, maybe not. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we'll remember it. And we'll live by it." Ethan thought for a moment, then said, "I think this was the best day of my life." James nodded, his heart full. "Mine too, buddy. Mine too." That night, after Ethan went to bed, James sat at the kitchen table, replaying the day in his mind. He thought about the shame he had felt at the counter, the despair of not being able to buy a simple meal. But then he remembered the moment Keanu stepped in, the kindness in his voice, and the way his son had learned a lesson greater than any school could teach. James realized something important: kindness had the power to heal wounds deeper than hunger. It had the power to restore dignity, to build hope, to inspire the next generation. The next day, the story had already begun to spread. Someone had posted about it online, sharing a photo of Keanu quietly paying at the counter. Thousands of people liked and commented, praising the actor's humility and compassion. But James didn't care about the online attention. For him, the true story wasn't about fame or viral posts. It was about the way his son had looked at him differently that day, with pride, with joy, with hope. Ethan woke up that morning still talking about tacos and superheroes. But most importantly, he kept repeating the words Keanu had told him: kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it can change everything. And James knew that, for his son, those words had planted a seed that would grow for the rest of his life. As the days passed, whenever James felt the weight of his struggles pressing down, he remembered that afternoon at Taco Bell. He remembered the kindness of a man who had no reason to help but chose to anyway. And he remembered that even in the hardest times, there was always hope, waiting to appear in the most unexpected ways. The world outside went on as usual, busy and loud. But for one father and his son, life had been forever changed. Not by wealth, not by fame, but by the simple, extraordinary power of kindness.